The last time my family contacted me, they wanted $127,000. Not, how are you? Not, we miss you. Not, happy birthday or Merry Christmas, or any of the things families say to people they actually love. Just my life savings, wrapped in a legal document that would have left me with nothing if their failing business collapsed. 8 years of silence, 288 ignored calls, and $23,000 sent with no acknowledgement. And when they finally remembered I existed, it was because they were desperate. I'm Danica, 34 years old, a senior accountant, and the kind of person who documents everything. And that habit is the reason I'm telling you this story today instead of being bankrupt and broken. If you're watching, please subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're from. Now, let me take you back to the moment I realized I was never a daughter to them, just an emergency fund with a heartbeat. I was 26 years old when I got my first real promotion, junior accountant at Morrison & Blake Consulting in Denver. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Earned through 3 years of 70-hour weeks and enough spreadsheets to wallpaper my entire apartment. The first person I called was my father. The phone rang 4 times before his voicemail picked up. "Hi, you've reached Dan Pennyfeather. Leave a message." I left one, then another the next day, and another 3 days after that. He never called back. 1 week later, I was scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break when I saw it. 47 people gathered around my half-brother Ken at his high school graduation party. Balloons, a 3-tier cake, my father's arm wrapped proudly around Derek's shoulders. Both of them are grinning like they just conquered the world. I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even known it was happening. Still, I sent Ken a congratulations card with a $500 check tucked inside. I figured maybe the mail had gotten lost. Maybe they tried to reach me and couldn't. I made excuses for them because that's what I'd been doing since I was 12 years old. Since my mother died and my father remarried Dawn 2 years later, Ken cashed the check within 3 days. I know because I checked my bank statement obsessively, waiting for some acknowledgement, a thank you text, a phone call, anything. Nothing came. That was the first time I started keeping records. Call it a professional habit. I'm an accountant after all. Every unanswered call, every unacknowledged gift, every silence that stretched longer than the one before. I didn't know it then, but those records would eventually save my life, or at least save me from losing everything I'd worked for. The pattern became clear over the next 5 years, though I refused to see it for what it was. Ken called me for the first time in 18 months when he was 23. No small talk, no how are you, sis? Just, I need $8,000 for a startup. It's a sure thing. I'll pay you back in 6 months. I wired the money that afternoon. The startup, some app for matching dog walkers with pet owners, folded 4 months later. Ken never mentioned repaying me. When I brought it up during one of my unanswered voicemails, I got a text back. "Things are tight. You understand?" I understood. I always understood. 3 years ago, Dawn texted me for the first time in 26 months. I still remember staring at my phone, heart racing, thinking maybe finally something had changed. Her message read, "Emergency roof damage from the storm. Need $15,000 for repairs. Your father's credit is maxed. Please help the family." I transferred the money within 48 hours, draining half my emergency fund. 2 months later, I saw her Instagram post. Dawn leaning against a brand new pearl white Lexus RX captioned, "Birthday gift to myself. Blessed to have a new car smell." The roof, as far as I could tell, looked exactly the same in every photo. $23,000. That's what I'd sent them over 5 years, not counting the smaller gifts, the cards with cash, or the subscription boxes at Christmas. $23,000. 0 thank you notes, 0 visits, 0 returned calls. But I kept sending birthday cards. I kept trying because I still believed that blood meant something, that if I just loved them enough, eventually they'd love me back. I was wrong, but it would take me 3 more years to admit it. 14 months. That's how long it had been since anyone in my family had acknowledged my existence in any form. I'd counted, not because I wanted to, but because the silence had become so absolute that I started marking the days like a prisoner scratching lines into a cell wall. During those 14 months, I called 17 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. I left messages that ranged from cheerful to just checking in, hope everyone's doing great, to concerned. Is everything okay? Please call me back. To finally be desperately honest. I just want to know if I did something wrong, please. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. I sent a Christmas card last December with a $200 gift card for each of them, Dan, Dawn, and Ken. I tracked the package, signature confirmed, delivered December 21st at 2:47 p.m. No response. Not a text, not an email, not even an automated thank you. By March, I'd started to accept a truth I'd been running from for 8 years. I didn't have a family anymore. Maybe I never really had. I came home from work on a Friday evening exhausted from month-end closing and checked my mailbox out of habit. Bills, junk mail, and credit card offers. And then, nestled between a water bill and a furniture catalog, I saw it. A cream-colored envelope, heavy cardstock, and my name written in elegant calligraphy across the front. In the upper left corner, embossed in gold, the Pennyfeather family. My hand trembled as I opened it. You are cordially invited to celebrate the 65th birthday of Dan Allen Pennyfeather, the Grand Palazzo Hotel, Houston, Texas, April 15th, 6 o'clock p.m. Black tie optional. After 14 months of silence, they'd finally remembered I existed. The question was, why now? I stared at that invitation for 2 hours. 87 guests. That's what the RSVP card indicated. A celebration for close friends, business associates, and cherished family. The Grand Palazzo Hotel was Houston's most exclusive event venue, the kind of place where oil executives and real estate moguls hosted their milestone moments. I'd looked it up online. Minimum booking fee of $35,000 for their grand ballroom. This wasn't a casual dinner. This was a statement. And somehow, after 8 years of silence, I'd made the guest list. Don't go. That was Greg Webb, my colleague and closest friend at Morrison & Blake. We'd worked together for 6 years, and he knew my family situation better than anyone. The unanswered calls, the one-way money transfers, and the holiday cards sent into a void. Why would they invite you now? Greg asked, spinning a pen between his fingers after 14 months of nothing. Maybe he's sick. Maybe this is his way of reaching out. Greg shook his head slowly. People don't change after 8 years without a reason, Danica. Not good reasons, anyway. He paused. Let me check something before you book a flight. Penny Feather Investments, right? Your dad's company. I nodded. Public filings are available through the Harris County Clerk's office. Real estate LLCs have to report certain things. Let me just take a look as a favor. I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe the invitation meant my father had finally realized what he'd been missing, that he wanted his daughter back in his life. But the accountant in me, the part that had been keeping records for 8 years, knew Greg was right. Something about this invitation didn't add up. Okay, I said quietly, check, but I'm probably going anyway. Greg called me 3 days later at 9:47 p.m. I was in my pajamas, halfway through a glass of wine, trying not to think about whether I should buy a new dress for the party. You need to see this, he said. I'm sending you a file right now. My laptop chimed. The email contained a PDF, 17 pages of public filings, court documents, and lien records for Penny Feather Investments, LLC. What I read made my stomach drop. Penny Feather Heights. That was my father's flagship project. 12 luxury townhouses in a gated community on the outskirts of Houston. According to these documents, construction was 7 months behind schedule. The original completion date was September of last year. It was now April, and the frames weren't even finished. It got worse. 3 contractors had filed lawsuits for non-payment. Martinez Construction for $89,000, Apex Electrical for $67,000, and Premier Plumbing for $124,000. Total outstanding, $280,000. The bank loan from First National, $2.1 million at 8.5% interest, had an extension deadline of April 20th, 5 days after the birthday party. If he doesn't secure additional capital by the 20th, Greg explained, the bank can call the entire loan, force a sale, and the project goes into receivership. I did the math. Even selling the partially completed units wouldn't cover the debt. Den Pennyfeather was about to lose everything. And how much would he need to stay afloat? Roughly $150,000, just enough to pay the contractors and convince the bank to extend. I had $127,000 in my savings account. Suddenly, the invitation made perfect sense. They don't want me there, I whispered. They want my money. I bought the plane ticket anyway. $342 one way, Denver to Houston, April 14th, arriving at 6:15 p.m. the night before the party. I told myself I needed to see this through. I needed to look my father in the eyes and understand once and for all whether I'd ever been anything more than a financial safety net. But I wasn't going in blind. Not this time. The night before my flight, I spent 4 hours printing documents, bank statements from the last 8 years showing every transfer. I'd made a list for the Pennyfeather family, dated and annotated and highlighted with screenshots of text messages, call logs from my phone carrier, and receipts for gifts sent via registered mail with signature confirmation. I organized everything into a manila folder, then copied the key documents onto a USB drive that I tucked into my carry-on. Old habit, always have a backup. At 7 a.m. on April 14th, I called Greg from the gate. If you don't hear from me in 48 hours, I said, send everything to my personal email, the bank statements, the court filings, all of it. Danica, this is insane. You know what they're planning? Why walk into the trap? I watched the boarding announcement flash on the screen because I need to know. I need to hear them say it or not say it. I need to close this chapter one way or another. Greg was quiet for a long moment. Be careful and call me the second you're out of there. I will. I boarded the plane with 8 years of evidence in my bag and a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. I wasn't going to Houston to reconcile. I was going to find out the truth, whatever that cost me. The Grand Palazzo Hotel looked exactly like its website photos and exactly like the kind of place where I didn't belong. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars, marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Staff in crisp black uniforms moved silently between guests who wore watches worth more than my annual rent. I checked my reflection in a gilded mirror near the entrance. My dress was black and simple, purchased from Nordstrom Rack for $89 during last year's clearance sale. It was the nicest thing I owned. Here, surrounded by Valentino gowns and Tom Ford suits, I looked like the hired help. The grand ballroom held 87 guests when I arrived. I'd counted the RSVPs on the invitation, and the reality matched. Clusters of well-dressed strangers clutching champagne flutes, a live jazz quartet playing softly in the corner, a champagne tower glittering under strategic lighting, and there, at the center of it all, stood my father. Dan Pennyfeather at 65 looked distinguished in a way that money bought. Silver hair swept back perfectly. A suit that probably cost more than my car. Cufflinks that caught the light when he gestured. Beside him, Dawn wore emerald green silk and diamonds at her throat and ears. Ken lounged nearby in a navy blazer, a Rolex catching the light every time he raised his glass. This was their world, their stage. Every person in this room was here to celebrate Dan Pennyfeather's success, his taste, his status. And I stood at the edge of it in my $89 dress, clutching a manila folder inside my bag like a lifeline. Dawn spotted me first. Her smile flickered just for a moment before settling into something that looked almost welcoming. "Oh," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "you actually came." My father turned at Dawn's words, and for a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Surprise? Calculation? It vanished before I could name it, replaced by a wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. Danica. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, arms outstretched. My daughter. It's been too long. 8 years, Dad. Has it really? He pulled me into a hug that felt rehearsed. Time flies. You look wonderful. I called 288 times. You never answered. Dawn inserted herself smoothly, her hand on my father's arm. We've been so busy with the business. You know how it is. Real estate never sleeps. Ken drifted over, champagne sloshing slightly in his glass. Hey, sis, looking good. Got anything exciting going on? New job? New investments? Do you need more money for another startup, Ken? His smile tightened. Just making conversation around us. Guests glanced our way with polite curiosity. The prodigal daughter returned for the patriarch's celebration. I could see them constructing the narrative in their heads. Family reunion, heartwarming moment, perhaps a toast later about the importance of togetherness. They had no idea. My father's hand found my elbow, steering me gently toward the far side of the ballroom. Come, I want to introduce you to some people. We have so much to catch up on. His grip was firm and purposeful. Dawn caught his eye and gave a small nod. Something passed between them, a signal, a confirmation. They'd planned this. Whatever came next, they'd rehearsed it. Actually, Dan said, lowering his voice as we approached a side door, there's something important I need to discuss with you first in private. The trap was closing, and I was walking straight into it. Before we could reach the side door, the band stopped playing. A spotlight swung toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, and my father's hand tightened on my elbow. Wait, he said this first. He guided me toward the stage, and I realized with growing unease that he intended for me to stand beside him in front of everyone. The event coordinator handed Dan a microphone. 87 faces turned our way. Friends, colleagues, family, Dan began, his voice rich with practiced warmth. Thank you all for being here to celebrate this milestone with me. 65 years, and I owe every success to the people in this room. Polite applause, champagne glasses raised. But tonight, I want to acknowledge someone very special. He turned to me, and I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. My daughter Danica has finally come home after many years away. The Pennyfeather family has always valued unity above all else, and having her here tonight means more than I can express. The applause swelled with smiles everywhere. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes. They were buying it. Every single person in this room was watching Dan Pennyfeather play the loving father, welcoming his arranged daughter, and they believed him completely. I saw a man in a gray suit near the bar, notebook in hand, scribbling rapidly. Press. Of course there was press. This wasn't just a birthday party, it was a performance. Family always comes first, Dan concluded, squeezing my shoulder. No matter how far we wander, we always find our way back home. More applause, camera flashes. I stood there with a smile frozen on my face, understanding with perfect clarity what was happening. He wasn't welcoming me back. He was rewriting history, and 87 witnesses had just watched him do it. The side room was smaller than I expected. A private parlor adjoining the ballroom, decorated in the same opulent style, but without the crowd. A mahogany table sat at its center, and on that table lay a stack of documents. Dawn and Ken were already inside waiting. The door clicked shut behind us, muffling the sounds of the party. Now we can talk, Dan said, gesturing toward the papers. Have a seat, sweetheart. I didn't sit. I walked to the table and looked at the top document. Authorization of Fund Transfer. Pennyfeather Investments, LLC. Account number partially redacted. An amount line left blank, but with $127,000 written in pencil beside it. Someone's note to themselves. What is this? An opportunity? Dan settled into a chair across from me, relaxed and confident. Pennyfeather Heights is going to be the most prestigious development in Harris County. Pre-sales are already exceeding projections. We just need a small capital injection to get through a temporary cash flow situation. You want my savings? I want you to invest in your family's legacy. He smiled. In 18 months, you'll double your return. I guarantee it. I flipped to page 3. There, buried in the fine print, I found what I was looking for. Non-refundable investment in the event of project dissolution or bankruptcy. I slipped my phone from my purse and took a photo of the page. Quick and casual, the accountant's instinct. What are you doing? Dawn's voice sharpened. Reviewing the terms. I'm a professional accountant, Dawn. I read contracts before I sign them. If you don't sign, Dawn said quietly, stepping closer, everyone out there will know exactly what kind of daughter you are, abandoning your father when he needs you most. There it was, the threat behind the velvet. Dan leaned forward, his salesman's smile firmly in place. The bank's extension deadline is Monday at 8 a.m. That gives us 72 hours to secure additional capital. Once we're over this hurdle, the project moves forward and everyone profits, including you. 72 hours? I repeated. And if I don't agree, then First National calls the loan? Pennyfeather Heights goes into foreclosure. 3 years of work gone. He spread his hands. You'd really let that happen to your own family? Derek chimed in, lounging against the wall with his champagne. Come on, sis. It's not like you have kids or a husband draining your accounts. You've got the money just sitting there. What's the big deal? I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Recognition. Let me make sure I understand, I said evenly. You haven't returned a single phone call in 8 years. You didn't come to my promotion celebration. You didn't acknowledge any birthday, any holiday, any gift I sent. And now you want me to hand over every dollar. I've saved since I was 22. Dawn's expression flickered. We've been busy. You cashed the checks, though. Every single one. Ken's got $8,000 for his startup. You have $15,000 for the roof repair. I looked at Dawn. That was a nice Lexus, by the way. Silence. Dan's smile had tightened. This isn't about the past, Danica. This is about families stepping up when it matters. You raised me until I was 18. I said that was your legal obligation. After that, I paid my own way. $68,000 in student loans, 9 years to pay them off. Don't frame your obligation as a favor I need to repay. Dawn stepped forward, and I saw the calculation in her eyes. If you won't sign in here, she said, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more public. I should have seen it coming. Dawn didn't wait for my response. She turned on her heel, threw open the door to the ballroom, and raised her voice loud enough to cut through the jazz quartet and champagne chatter. Everyone, please, I need your attention. The music faltered. Conversations died. 87 faces turned toward us. Dawn positioned herself in the doorway, framed perfectly by the light. One hand pressed dramatically to her chest. I'm so sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion, but I need you all to know what's happening. Dan's daughter, the one he welcomed home tonight with open arms, has just refused to help her own father in his time of need. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 8 years, Dawn's voice rose. 8 years she's been gone, never called, never visited, and now, when her father asks for help, a simple family investment, she says no, right here at his birthday celebration. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the narrative spin out of her control and into mine. No, that wasn't right. This was her control. Every word calculated to make me the villain. We tried so hard to reach her, Dawn continued, dabbing at dry eyes all those years. But she was too busy with her life in Colorado, too busy for her own family. And now, Dawn. Dan's voice was sharp. That's enough. But it wasn't enough. Not for her. She'd found her audience, and she was playing to them with the skill of someone who'd spent decades performing the role of devoted wife and stepmother. The guests looked at me with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. The man in the gray suit was writing furiously. I had become the villain in my own story unless I changed the script. The whisper started immediately. Abandoned her own father. 8 years. Can you imagine? And at his birthday party, of all places. I stood in the doorway. 87 pairs of eyes dissecting me, judging me, finding me wanting. A woman in pearls shook her head slowly. A man in a 3-piece suit muttered something to his wife that made her weep. An elderly woman, I vaguely recognized her as a distant aunt, approached me with disappointment carved into every line of her face. Your father gave you everything, she said, put a roof over your head, and sent you to school. And this is how you repay him? I opened my mouth to respond, but what could I say? That he stopped paying for anything the day I turned 18? That I'd worked 2 jobs through college? That I'd sent them $23,000 over 5 years and never received so much as a thank you? They wouldn't believe me. They'd already chosen their story. The journalist in this gray suit was watching me with undisguised interest, his pen hovering over his notebook. I could see the headline forming behind his eyes. Family drama erupts at real estate mogul's birthday gala. Dan stood behind Dawn now, his expression carefully neutral, letting his wife do the dirty work while he maintained plausible deniability. Ken smirked from the champagne table, and something shifted inside me. 8 years, 288 unanswered calls, $23,000 sent into a void, and this public humiliation was how they treated me when I finally said no. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn love from people who saw me as nothing more than an emergency fund. I was done trying. Excuse me, I said quietly, and began walking toward the stage. The microphone was still on the stand where Dan had left it, the spotlight still pointed at the stage. I stepped into its glare before anyone could stop me. Everyone, my voice came through the speakers clear and steady. I'd like 5 minutes of your time. The room went still. Dawn moved toward me, her face twisted with alarm. Danica, what do you think of your 5 minutes? I repeated, looking out at the crowd. Then you can go back to your champagne and your assumptions. I think you deserve to hear the full story before you decide who the villain is. I saw Dan's jaw clench. Ken set down his champagne glass. The journalist in gray leaned forward, pen ready. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. My name is Danica Pennyfeather. I'm 34 years old. I'm a senior management accountant at Morrison & Blake Consulting in Denver. And I've been trying to stay connected to this family for 8 years. I looked at Dawn, at Dan, at the 87 witnesses who had already decided I was the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her dying father. You've heard one version of this story tonight. Now, let me show you another. My hands were steady as I connected my phone to the ballroom's display system, the same system they'd used earlier for the slideshow of Dan's greatest achievements. The main screen behind me flickered to life. I've been silent for 8 years, I said. I've sent money when asked, called when ignored, and made excuses for people who couldn't be bothered to remember my birthday. Tonight, I'm going to stop being silent. I pressed play. Let's start with the numbers. Hey everyone, before I continue, I have to ask, what would you have said up there in front of 87 people who already thought you were the villain? Would you have walked away? Would you have fought back? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let me tell you exactly what I showed them. The first document appeared on the screen behind me, a bank statement from Chase dated January 2017. This is a wire transfer for $8,000, I explained, keeping my voice level. Sent to Ken Pennyfeather for a startup investment that failed 4 months later. No repayment, no acknowledgement. I swiped to the next image. March 2021. $15,000 transferred to Dawn Pennyfeather for emergency roof repairs. I let that sit for a moment. 2 months later, Dawn posted a picture of her new Lexus on Instagram. The roof, as far as I know, remains unchanged. Murmurs from the crowd. Dawn's face had gone pale. Over the past 8 years, I have transferred $23,000 to members of this family. Every single transfer is documented here. Bank statements, wire confirmations, dates, amounts. I pulled up the call log next. 3 pages of outgoing calls, each one highlighted in yellow. 288 phone calls, all outgoing. You can see the duration here. Most of them end at 0 minutes and 0 seconds. That's what happens when you go straight to voicemail. Someone in the crowd coughed nervously. And here, I switched to a screenshot. Are the only 2 text messages I've received nothing from this family in 8 years, both requesting money? No, how are you? No, happy birthday. No, we miss you. The elderly aunt who'd scolded me earlier was staring at the screen with her mouth slightly open. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me, I said. I'm showing you facts because someone just told this room that I abandoned my family. The numbers suggest a different story. I looked directly at Dan. Your turn to explain, Dad. Or should I keep going? Dan's face had gone from confident to granite. He didn't move. Fine, I said. Let me continue. I pulled up the next set of documents, the public filings Greg had sent me. Pennyfeather Heights, 12 luxury townhouses, is my father's flagship project. I pointed to the screen. These are public records from the Harris County Clerk's Office. Anyone in this room can verify them. The first filing appeared, a lawsuit from Martinez Construction dated October of last year. $89,000 in unpaid invoices. 3 contractors are currently suing Pennyfeather Investments for non-payment. Total outstanding, $280,000. I heard someone gasp. An older gentleman near the bar set down his drink very carefully. The project is 7 months behind schedule. The $2.1 million bank loan from First National has an extension deadline of April 20th. That's 5 days from now. I pulled up the final document, the authorization of fund transfer I'd photographed 30 minutes earlier. This is what they asked me to sign tonight. See this clause here? Non-refundable investment in the event of project dissolution. That means if the project fails, which it very well might, I lose everything. The room had gone completely silent. They didn't invite me to this party because they missed me, I said. They invited me because they needed $127,000. That's my entire life savings, 12 years of work, and they wanted me to hand it over with no recourse if it all collapses. I looked at the journalist who was writing so fast his hand was blurring. You want to verify any of this? Harris County Clerk's Office. Case numbers are right there on the screen. Behind me, Dan finally spoke. Danica, you're destroying this family. No, Dad, you already did that.
Dan stepped toward the stage, his composure cracking like thin ice. This is private family business, he said, his voice carrying that authoritative boom he used to close deals. Danica is clearly emotional and confused. I'm a certified management accountant, Dad. I literally analyze financial documents for a living. I'm not confused. Dawn rushed forward, heels clicking against the marble. She's trying to sabotage us. Years of silence, and now she shows up to humiliate her own father in front of his friends and colleagues. You invited me, Dawn. You sent the invitation to my address. We were trying to include you to bring the family together. I held up my phone, still connected to the display. Should I pull up the email you sent to Dad's lawyer 6 weeks ago? The one where you specifically mention my savings account and discuss the necessity of presenting a unified family front to secure my cooperation? Dawn's face went white.
How did you CC Dad's company email, which he shares with his business partner, who shares an accountant with my firm? I kept my voice calm. I'm very good at my job, Dawn. Derek pushed away from the bar, swaying slightly. This is ridiculous. She's just mad because she never fit in. She never knew Ken. Dan cut in sharply. Stop talking. But Ken was already past listening. We're supposed to pretend she's some kind of victim. She left. She moved across the country and barely called. 288 calls, I said quietly. Would you like me to show the log again? Silence. The journalist's pen had stopped moving. He was just staring now, transfixed by the unfolding disaster. In the crowd, I saw a man. I recognized from the news a real estate developer who'd partnered with my father on 2 previous projects. He was already heading for the exit. The first person to speak was not who I expected. He was an older gentleman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades closing boardroom deals. I recognized him from the earlier slideshow. Gary Morrison, one of my father's oldest business associates. Dan, his voice carried across the silent ballroom. You owe $300,000 to contractors, and you're throwing a party that costs what? $50,000 or $60,000? Dan's jaw tightened. Gary, this isn't it. I was going to invest another $200,000 in your new development next month. Gary set down his champagne glass with a decisive clink. I think I'll be reconsidering that. He walked toward the exit without looking back. The elderly aunt who had scolded me earlier approached the stage, her face transformed by something that looked like genuine regret. Young lady, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I had no idea. Dan always said you were too busy to visit, that you preferred your independence. I preferred a family that returned my phone calls, ma'am. She nodded slowly, then turned to look at Dan with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment and disgust, both. More guests were leaving now, not rushing. This crowd was too polished for that, but definitely leaving. The whispers had changed direction. Lawsuit against contractors. Tried to take her savings. She had receipts for everything. I saw Dawn trying to intercept departing guests. Her desperate. This is all a misunderstanding. She's always been difficult. Dan is a wonderful father. No one was stopping to listen. The journalist in gray caught my eye.
and nodded once. Not approval exactly, more like acknowledgement. This was a story now. It would be in print by morning. Dan stood alone in the center of his own party, watching his empire crumble in real time. I stepped down from the stage. The remaining guests parted for me like I was carrying something contagious. Or maybe something they didn't want to catch. Failure, scandal, the truth. Dan intercepted me halfway to the door. Up close, I could see the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the desperate calculations still working behind his expression. Danica? His voice had dropped low for only me to hear. You've made your point. Now, let's talk about how we fix this. There's nothing to fix, Dad. I'm your father. Doesn't that mean anything? I looked at him. I really looked, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not triumph, just a deep, hollow sadness. I spent 8 years trying to be your daughter, I said. You spent 8 years treating me like a backup bank account. I'm done auditioning for a role I was never going to get. I pulled the authorization of fund transfer from my bag, the copy I'd photographed earlier. Slowly, deliberately, I tore it in half, then in quarters. This is my answer. I placed the pieces in his hand. Dawn was crying now. Real tears or performance, I couldn't tell. Ken had disappeared, probably to the open bar. The remaining guests pretended to examine the ceiling, the chandeliers, and anything but the dying patriarch of penny feather investments. I walked to the exit and paused at the doorway. I tried for 8 years, I said loud enough for anyone still listening to hear. I don't need your approval anymore. From tonight, you don't have a daughter. I stepped into the Houston night, the door swinging shut behind me. For the first time in 8 years, I felt like I could breathe. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of what came next. I called Greg from the Houston airport at 11:47 p.m. I saw the video, he said before I could speak. Someone posted it on Facebook 20 minutes ago. Danica, are you okay? I'm okay. I was surprised to find it was true. I'm at the airport taking the red eye home. Video's already got 1,200 views. The comment section is intense. I hadn't thought about the phones. Of course people had recorded it. 87 witnesses with smartphones. And I just put on the performance of my life. It's going to get worse before it gets better, I said. The journalist was from the Houston Business Journal. This will be in print by morning. Let it be. Greg's voice was firm. You told the truth. That's all you did. I watched a plane take off through the terminal window, its lights disappearing into the darkness. I'm going to change my name. Silence on the line. I know it sounds drastic, I continued, but I've been thinking about it for months. I don't want to be Danica Pennyfeather anymore. I don't want that name. I don't want any connection to them. Is that even possible? Yes, Colorado allows legal name changes for any reason that isn't fraud-related. I've already researched the process. The accountant in me is always 3 steps ahead. The filing fee is $98. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks. What name are you choosing? I smiled, the first real smile in hours. Michelle Sharp, my grandmother's name, my mother's mother, the last person in my family who actually loved me without conditions. Greg was quiet for a moment. Michelle Sharp, I like it. I'm going to disappear. Greg, new name, new city, new life. They won't be able to find me. And what about Ken, Dawn, and Dan? Let them live with the consequences of their choices. I'm done cleaning up their messes. Linda Hartwell's office was on the third floor of a modest building in downtown Denver. She specialized in identity law, name changes, witness protection consultations, and people starting over for one reason or another. Your situation is straightforward, she said, sliding a folder across her desk. Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 1315101. You can petition for a legal name change as long as you're not doing it to evade creditors, escape criminal liability, or commit fraud. I just want to stop being a penny feather. That's a perfectly valid reason, Linda smiled. She'd clearly heard similar stories before. Here's how the process works. We file a petition for change of name with the Denver District Court with a $98 filing fee. The court sets a hearing date, usually within 6 to 8 weeks. Assuming there are no objections, the judge issues a court order and your new name becomes legal. I looked at the form. Petitioner's current legal name, Danica Claire Pennyfeather. Proposed new legal name, I wrote carefully, Michelle Marie Sharp. After the order is issued, Linda continued, you'll need to update your Social Security card, driver's license, passport, bank accounts, everything. It's tedious, but not complicated. And if my family tries to find me, your new name is public record if they know where to look. But there's nothing requiring you to tell them. No forwarding address, no notification. You simply become a different person, legally speaking. I signed the petition. One more thing, Linda said as I stood to leave. I've been doing this for 15 years. The people who change their names because they want to escape abusive or exploitative family situations almost never regret it. It's the ones who keep hoping the family will change who end up back in my office heartbroken. I'm done hoping, I said. Good. See you in 6 weeks, Miss Sharp. 8 weeks later, Danica Pennyfeather ceased to exist. The court order arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a single sheet of paper that changed everything. Case number 2024C V3892 in the matter of Danica Claire Pennyfeather, petitioner. The petition for change of name is hereby granted. The petitioner's legal name shall henceforth be Michelle Marie Sharp. I stared at it for a long time. Then I got to work. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young couple with a new baby. Excited about the neighborhood, thrilled by the price. A $285,000 cash offer. After paying off the remaining mortgage, I walked away with $112,000. I canceled my phone number, the same number I'd had for 12 years, the one I'd left on 88 voicemails that were never returned. Gone. I deleted my email accounts, my Facebook profile, my LinkedIn, and everything that said Danica Pennyfeather disappeared from the digital world. Greg was the only connection to my old life. I gave him a P-Box address in Portland, Oregon for emergencies only, and if anyone asks, you haven't heard from me in years. They're already calling. He said, your father's assistant, some lawyer. They keep asking if I know where you are. You don't. That's the truth. He nodded. Be safe. Michelle. It felt strange hearing that name out loud. Strange, but right. I boarded a plane to Portland on a gray June morning. New city,
New name, new beginning. The woman who stepped off that plane wasn't Danica Pennyfeather anymore. The invisible daughter, the endless giver, the emergency bank account. She was Michelle Sharp, and for the first time in her 34 years, she belonged to nobody but herself. Greg called me in November. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. "It's over." I was sitting in my new apartment in Portland, watching rain streak down the windows, 11 stories up, overlooking the Willamette River. Small, but mine. Pennyfeather Heights foreclosed in July. First National called the loan when your father couldn't secure additional capital. The project went into receivership. The bank took a loss of about $800,000. Your father? Greg paused. He lost everything. Danica Michel. Sorry, I'm still getting used to that. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Just a hollow finality, like watching a building you used to live in finally collapse. The Houston Business Journal ran a follow-up piece last month. Greg continued. Local developers' family drama goes viral. 23,000 views online. They interviewed some of the guests from the party. Nobody's investing with him anymore. And the house. The River Oaks property went on the market in September. He needed to sell to cover the contractor lawsuits. The article said he's renting a condo in the suburbs. Now, I thought about the man I'd seen at the party. Silver-haired in a Tom Ford suit, surrounded by admirers, the patriarch of the Pennyfeather family, master of his domain, is now living in a rental condo, his reputation in ruins. The Houston Real Estate Investors Association voted to revoke his membership, Greg added. Conduct unbecoming or something like that. He's essentially blacklisted from every major deal in the city. I closed my eyes. Thank you for telling me. Are you okay? Was I? I wasn't sure. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt distant, like I was reading about someone else's life. I'm okay, I said. I'm building something new. Derek tried to find me first. Greg told me about it in January. My half-brother had apparently spent 3 weeks attempting to track me down through every channel he could think of. He messaged my old Facebook account, which was deactivated, called my old phone number, which was disconnected, and emailed my old Gmail account, which no longer exists. He showed up at Morrison and Blake Consulting, asking for Danica Pennyfeather. The receptionist told him no one by that name worked there because Michelle Sharp's personnel file made no mention of a previous identity. He even drove to my old house in Denver. The new owners, understandably confused, told him the previous owner had moved 6 months ago. No forwarding address. No, they didn't know where. He seems desperate, Greg said, not hostile, just lost. I processed this information carefully. Ken had never been cruel. Exactly. Just entitled and thoughtless, the product of parents who'd given him everything and expected nothing. He sent a letter to your old address, Greg continued. The new owners forwarded it to me since I handled the sale paperwork. Do you want me to send it to you? I thought about it for a long moment. Yes. The letter arrived a week later, handwritten on plain notebook paper. Ken's penmanship had always been terrible. I remembered teasing him about it when we were younger, before everything fell apart. Danica, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I'm sorry. I didn't know about the phone calls. I didn't know about the money. Mom, Dawn controlled everything, and I just went along with it because it was easier. I'm working at Best Buy now. First real job. First time paying my own rent. I get it now.
Kind of. Please write back. Please. I folded the letter and put it away. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Hey everyone, before I continue, I want to ask you something.
A lot of people have asked me, did I ever feel guilty? Did I miss my family? Would I ever give Ken a second chance? I'll answer that in a moment. But first, if you're still watching, please take a second to like this video. It really helps the channel and it lets me know these stories matter to you. Okay, let me tell you what happened next. Dawn's downfall was quieter than Dan's, but no less complete. I heard about it through Greg, who heard about it from a colleague who'd attended a charity gala in Houston. The kind of event Dawn used to dominate. Designer gown, strategic positioning, air kisses with the right people. She hadn't been invited this year. Word had spread through the social circles that mattered to her. The video from the party, the lawsuits, the foreclosure, but mostly the video. Someone had edited it down to the key moments. Dawn's public accusation, my evidence, her face going white when I mentioned her Lexus. 300,000 views across various platforms. The comments were brutal. Imagine trying to steal your stepdaughter's savings and calling her ungrateful. The stepmother from every fairy tale, except this is real life. Queen of gaslighting caught on camera. Her friends, the women she'd brunched with, vacationed with, and competed with for decades, had quietly dropped her from their group chats, their dinner parties, and their lives. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman from that video. The country club membership lapsed when they couldn't pay the dues. The Lexus was sold. The diamonds Dawn had worn to Dan's birthday were now in a pawn shop somewhere. And the marriage, according to Greg's sources, was hanging by a thread. Dan blames her for the public confrontation. He reported that she said if she just kept quiet, they could have handled it privately. They've been fighting constantly. I imagined them in their rental condo, the walls closing in, each of them pointing fingers at the other, while their carefully constructed lives crumbled around them. I didn't feel sorry for Dawn, but I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt free. My father hired a private investigator in February. Greg discovered this by accident. The investigator had called Morrison and Blake asking questions about a former employee named Danica Pennyfeather. Standard due diligence, he'd claimed, a background check for a financial matter. The receptionist, properly trained, had declined to provide any information. According to Greg, the investigator was charging $3,000 a week. For 2 months, Dan Pennyfeather paid someone to search for a daughter who didn't exist anymore. Danica Pennyfeather's trail ended at Denver District Court, case number 2024C V 03892. But Colorado law didn't require that name change records include the new name in public-facing documents without a court order, which required proving harm. My father couldn't access the sealed portion of the file. The investigator told Dan, it's a dead end. Greg said she changed her name, sold her house, and canceled all her accounts. If she doesn't want to be found, she won't be found. $24,000. That's what my father spent trying to locate me. The irony wasn't lost on me. 8 years ago, he couldn't be bothered to return a phone call. Now, he was hemorrhaging money he couldn't afford, desperately searching for the daughter he'd ignored for a decade. He called the investigator off last week, Greg added. said he couldn't afford to continue. I sat with that information for a long time. Part of me, a small, stubborn part I'd been trying to silence for months, wondered if this meant he actually cared. If losing everything had finally made him see what he'd thrown away.
But the larger part of me knew better. He wasn't looking for his daughter. He was looking for his last remaining asset. And that asset had made her impossible to find. Winter in Portland was gray and wet and absolutely beautiful. I'd found an apartment in the Pearl District, 11 floors up, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Willamette River. On clear days, I could see Mount Hood in the distance. On gray days, which was most of them, I watched the rain and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. My new job at Pacific Northwest Financial was everything my old position had been, minus the baggage. Same work, audits, reconciliations, the satisfying puzzle of making numbers balance, different contexts, different names on my desk, and different people answering when someone called. Michelle, can you look at these quarterly projections? Michelle, lunch in the break room. Michelle, we're doing drinks Friday. Are you in? Every time I heard that name, something settled a little deeper in my chest. I'd made friends, real ones. Kim from accounting, who loved true crime podcasts. James from legal, who made the best coffee and always shared. The Thursday night yoga class, where nobody knew anything about me except that I showed up every week. Oh, Christmas was approaching, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't buy cards for the Pennyfeather family. I didn't agonize over gift selections that would never be acknowledged. I didn't spend December wondering if this would be the year they finally called. Instead, I decorated my apartment with string lights. I bought a small tree from the farmer's market. I accepted an invitation to Christmas dinner at Kim's parents' house. Strangers who welcomed me because their daughter said I was worth knowing. On Christmas morning, I woke up alone in my apartment, made coffee, and watched the rain fall over the city. I didn't miss them. I missed the idea of them, but the reality was I was better without it. The letter arrived in January, and Greg had forwarded it through our agreed-upon system. His address is my P.O. box. There is no return address on the outer envelope. Inside was a second envelope, crumpled and readdressed multiple times. Ken's handwriting. I made tea before opening it, sat by the window, watched the boats on the river. Then I read Danica, or whatever you're called now. I know you probably won't read this. You've probably thrown away everything I've sent, but I'm going to keep trying because that's all I know how to do anymore. I'm working at Best Buy, floor sales, minimum wage plus commission. It's humiliating and exhausting, and the best thing that ever happened to me. For the first time in my life, I'm earning something instead of just receiving it. Dad lost everything. You probably know that. Mom, Dawn, she moved out last month. They're getting divorced. He's alone in that condo, drinking too much, calling old contacts who won't take his calls. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for him. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know that I understand now what it's like to work for something, what it's like to be ignored by people who are supposed to care, what it's like to realize you were wrong about everything. I'm trying to be better. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I wanted you to know I'm trying. Your brother, if you'll still have me, Ken. I folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. Then I got a fresh sheet of paper and wrote my response. Short, clear, honest. Ken, I read your letter. I'm glad you're learning, but I'm not ready for a relationship with anyone from that family. Maybe someday, maybe never. I hope you understand. V. I mailed it the next day. No return address. Here's what nobody tells you about setting boundaries. It feels selfish until it doesn't. For 8 years, I'd measured my worth by how much I could give to people who never gave back. Every unanswered call was a test I'd failed. Every ignored gift was proof. I wasn't trying hard enough. I'd built my entire identity around being the good daughter, the reliable one, the family member who always showed up. And what had it gotten me? A spot at a birthday party designed to extract my life savings. Sitting in my Portland apartment, watching the winter rain, I finally understood something that had taken me 34 years to learn. Boundaries aren't walls. They're not about shutting people out. They're about deciding who gets access to your life and on what terms. I didn't hate Dan. I didn't hate Dawn. I didn't even hate Ken, who was finally starting to become the person he should have been all along. I just didn't have space for them anymore. My therapist, yes, I'd started seeing one, a gentlewoman named Dr. Coleman, who specialized in family estrangement, called it radical acceptance. You're not responsible for their choices, she said during one of our sessions. You're only responsible for yours, and you chose to protect yourself. That's not selfish. That's survival. I thought about all the years I'd spent hoping they would change, all the energy I'd poured into a relationship that only flowed one direction. Now, I use that energy for other things, for friendships that nourished me, for work that fulfilled me, and for a life that was mine alone. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was something simpler and more powerful, self-respect. And that, I realized, was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Spring came to Portland in early March, cherry blossoms lining the streets, sunshine breaking through the clouds, the whole city exhaling after months of gray. I was sitting at my favorite coffee shop near the waterfront, laptop open, reviewing projections for a client meeting when my phone buzzed. Dinner tonight. That new Thai place, Kim. I smiled and typed back, yes, 7 p.m., perfect. Bring your appetite. I'm ordering everything. I closed my laptop and looked out the window. A young couple walked by with a stroller. An old man fed pigeons on the corner. A group of tourists took photos of the bridges. Ordinary moments, the kind I'd spent 8 years waiting to share with a family that never wanted to share them with me. Now, I shared them with people who actually showed up. My savings account was recovering slower than before, but steadily. Pacific Northwest Financial had offered me a senior position with a raise. I was thinking about buying a small condo, maybe something with a view of the river. For the first time in my life, I was making plans without factoring in what my family might need from me. I used to think that family was blood, that being a penny feather meant something fundamental about who I was and what I owed, that if I just tried hard enough, loved hard enough, and gave enough of myself, eventually they would love me back. I was wrong. Family is the people who choose to be in your life, who call you back, who show up without being asked, and who want nothing from you except your presence. I'm Michelle Sharp now, 35 years old, accountant, friend, survivor. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly who my family is. They're the ones who chose me just as I am.
Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If you've ever been treated like an ATM by the people who were supposed to love you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to know you're not alone. And walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. Please like this video if my story resonated with you.
Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And check out the other stories in the description. I think you'll find something that speaks to you. I'm Michelle Sharp. New name, new life.